I'm sure to you all there in America now. I love the story of Esther, don't you? And if we could have the PowerPoint now, please. The verse that is probably the most famous and the one that I want us to focus on is the one where it says, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." When I was getting ready to return to Nepal as a BMS volunteer in 2015, you might remember that there had been a big earthquake in the country, and so there was a lot of damage and a lot of people had lost their homes and their houses, and many people died. And many of my colleagues and my friends in Scotland said, "You shouldn't go now, Joy, it's too dangerous." And they won't want you to come anyway because they'll be too busy trying to rebuild their lives. And so many people said that to me that I began to doubt whether I should go or not. But this verse really spoke to me and confirmed that it was the right time for me to go. And I wasn't exactly sure what for, but I trusted that God had plans for me at such a time as that. And I think this is not just a motivational verse for Christians, but it is a reminder of how God puts us in certain places and certain situations at specific times for his purposes. God isn't mentioned at all in the book of Esther, but there's very clear evidence of his divine purpose. And Esther wasn't there by accident. She'd been well prepared by Mordecai. She'd been brought up as a Jew. And then she'd been chosen by the king to be the queen. She was the only person who could help her people at such a time as that. And as Simon has said, I'm leaving BMS, I'm leaving Nepal after 14 years of working there. And so it's natural, I suppose, at this time that I should look back over the years that I've been with BMS in Nepal. And in all of it, I can see that God has prepared me and placed me in situations at just the right time, even if it didn't always seem like it, thanks, at the right time. Can we have the next? Great. In 1989, I first went to Nepal as a teacher of mission children. And in those days, it was common that mission workers arrived in the country and didn't know exactly which project or which place they would be asked to work in. And so I arrived in Kathmandu and started language training. And then I was asked if I would go for a week's orientation to a place called Okhaldunga. I didn't even know where it was, and it was difficult to say, although for a Scottish person, it's quite a nice sounding name, Okhaldunga. And I went for my week's orientation. I remember crying a lot that week. Okhaldunga seemed so difficult, such a difficult place to be. The journey was hard. I got a plane. There were only 2 planes a week. But even after I got off the plane, it was 5 hours hard walk. You've seen the hills, up and down the hills. And if I didn't catch a plane, I knew that it would be 5 days walk to the road. It seemed so remote. I was going to be the only single person in the project. There wasn't a schoolroom yet. I would have to organize for one to be built before I could start teaching. Relationships in the team were difficult. There'd been an earthquake and the hospital was destroyed. It seems that I follow earthquakes sometimes, so I hope you're okay here in Redditch. There were very few Christians in the church, and the local Rai people distrusted us to some extent, and the pastor of our church was in jail, not because he'd done anything wrong, but for preaching the gospel. And as a timid 30-year-old, it just seemed too difficult, too much. And I decided when I went back to Kathmandu, I would ask for another placement. So as expected, the education director called me into the office when I got back, and he said something like, "I know Okhaldunga is not an easy place to work, but are you willing to go there as a tutorial group teacher?" And I opened my mouth to say no, and I heard myself say, "Yes, I'll go." And so are we going to move on? Oh, yeah, there we go. Scrape the archives for this picture. That was about 1992, me with some of the children that I taught in UMN. And of course, I settled into life in Okhaldunga. I got my walking legs, and I came to love the people and the place. And I came to understand the culture. There were very few people in the village who spoke English, and so the limited phrases and words that I'd learnt in language school soon grew, and I became much more confident at speaking Nepali. And as well as teaching the children of missionaries, I was able to work in a local school. And so I learnt how the curriculum worked and how the school system was organized. I even had the opportunity to help set up a local school for the children in the hospital staff and the village children. And so I appointed and trained the first teachers, helped to organize the classes and the timetable. And little did I know that that would be exactly what I was doing with my work in Equip several years later. But God was using that time, even though it was a difficult place, to prepare me for the rest of my adventure in Nepal. In the 1990s, Christians were being widely persecuted in Nepal, and so we had to be very careful what we said and did. And it was sometimes quite frustrating not to be able to speak openly and to witness. And the church was very small, and we met hidden in a little room in the hospital compound because we were afraid of persecution. And although we prayed and witnessed, we didn't see the church grow. Even though we knew that the church was growing in other places, we didn't see that in Okhaldunga. I had great expectations of what I was going to do as a mission worker. I'd been sent out by BMS, I'd been commissioned by my church, I was supported by lots of praying people like yourselves around the country. What was I doing in Okhaldunga if God's kingdom wasn't growing? Why was I there? And I remember sharing that with a colleague, and we prayed together. And as we prayed, I realized that God was saying, I've brought you to Okhaldunga not so much for what you can do for me, but for what I want to do in your life. And I think that is true for all of us, that sometimes we have great ideas and plans of how we're going to serve God in our church, in our local community. And that is great, and God wants us to do that. But often through the joys and the challenges of that, he works in us to bring us closer to himself and make us more like the person he wants us to be. And I knew that God was working in my life and was preparing me in so many ways for what was to come in the future. A few years ago, I had the privilege of returning to Okhaldunga, and it was great to see the changes that had taken place. There's a new hospital in the bottom right, the red buildings with solar panels on the roof, and it's meeting a great need of providing health services in that area. And the school is still there. That's the long yellow building in the top left with lots of windows, still providing an education for the children in that village. And that was great to see. But the biggest change was in the church, because now the believers meet twice a week because they can't all fit into the building. And they have a nice big building, and it's on top of the hill. So from hiding down in the valley, hidden in the hospital, to a big church shining out on the top of the hill, that seemed like a miracle. And while I was there, I learned about how that had happened. There was a guy in the hospital who was very anti-Christian, and he persecuted anybody who wanted to join the church or come to Jesus in faith. And so nobody did because they were afraid. His son, who was educated in our school, went off to work eventually in the Middle East, as many Nepalis do. And while he was there, he met a Nepali believer who shared the gospel with him. And he came to faith. And he came back to Okhaldunga in fear and trepidation to tell his dad that he'd become a believer, a Christian. And his father said, "If you believe that foreign religion, you're no son of mine, don't ever come home again." That was difficult to hear. But he went back to Kathmandu, and he went to Bible college, and he trained to become a pastor, and he met his beautiful wife, another Christian lady. But he didn't give up on his family. He would go whenever there was something to celebrate or some difficulty, he would go and be there. And when the buffalo got sick, he went and prayed for the buffalo, and the buffalo got better. And slowly, his father came to see that there might be something in this foreign faith that his son had. And he came to believe in Jesus too. And when we were there, we were invited to go to a baptism down by the river. We'd never been allowed to go before because it was too dangerous, but there were 10 people being baptized. And the first one was the pastor's grandmother, Mighty's mother, the guy who persecuted the Christians all those years ago, and now his whole family believe in Jesus. So why didn't God answer our prayers when we wanted them to? We often pray, don't we, and we want God to work now because it's important to us. And sometimes God says, wait. And he waits for his perfect time, because I believe that he waited until this family were ready to come to faith, because that has been a huge witness in that area. If God can work in such a powerful way in somebody who is so anti-Christian, then surely he is a God to be trusted in. And I learned too, and I think we can all learn, that sometimes we need to wait for God's perfect timing. In COVID, I just started my work as a teacher trainer, and I was excited to get in schools. And then COVID came and we couldn't go. And I had to trust that God's timing was perfect. You might remember that I'd been writing some books that we needed for our school teachers to use about phonics. And the publisher had promised that they would be ready in March for the new school year, and they weren't ready. And that was frustrating. And more frustrating was the fact that the publisher wasn't answering my phone calls or emails, so I didn't know why or what had happened. And I had to trust that it would happen in God's perfect time. When I was in Kathmandu just before I left Nepal, the publisher called me on the phone and invited me to dinner. I still don't know why the books weren't published, but we restored our friendship, our relationship, and I believe that that is more important than getting the books printed at the right time. And he's promised that the books will be ready for next March. We'll see. But we can trust that God's timing is perfect. For the last 4 years, I've been living and working in this beautiful place, which Simon was able to come and visit me there. We live in a valley, but we can see the mountains. It's very beautiful. But it's not an easy place to live. Sometimes the roads are like this, and I was wishing I had my wellies as I walked to school when it was very muddy. And all our schools are on top of the hill, and so that's a picture of me looking very hot and flustered as I was trying to get to one of our schools. And it's not an easy place to be, and there are very few foreigners. In fact, during COVID, I was the only white person in town. But because I knew the language, because I understood the culture, because I love the food, it was quite easy for me to adapt to the Nepali culture and society, to their community. And I felt very welcome and very supported by my Nepali neighbors and the teachers. And many times I've realized over the last years that God had prepared me not only to live and thrive in such a community, even if there are no other expats, but that he had a real purpose for me to be there at that particular time. During COVID, a neighbor's son, Ayush, had online classes, and as they couldn't afford Wi-Fi in his home, he came to study on my porch every day. He came at 6 a.m. in the morning, so I had to get up. It was a real incentive to get up, and I gave him a drink and a banana, and I got to know him really well. He was there all morning, and we got to know each other very well. He loved to bake cakes, and so we often made chocolate and banana cakes in my kitchen. That was his favorite, and he loved to eat them as well, of course. So I got to know the family. He and his little brother called me Auntie, and their young mum became a good friend. One day, they came back from church to find that Ayush's father had disappeared, and they were not able to make contact even today. Up until today, they have no contact with Ayush's father. And so he'd left them with huge debts and no income to pay for food and education. In an instant, their stable life had disappeared, and they had no hope for the future. Ayush, who had just finished grade 7, thought he would have to leave school, and because there was no money to pay for the fees, and that maybe he would need to work to earn some money to feed the family. Normally, at such times, family members would help, but since they became Christians, their family have not even spoken to them. So there was no hope of help from them. What options did they have? Here, if that happened to a family, there would be some support from somewhere. But what hope? How would they survive? But because I was there, because I lived just over the road, because I knew the family and we had a relationship, I was able to spend time with them as a family. And together we talked, we cried, and we prayed. And we managed to work out a solution to keep both the boys in school. Ayusha's little brother, Aros, is only 2, but he had to start school at age 2. Not ideal, but especially as nursery education is very formal in Nepal. But he had to do that so that his mum had a little time each day to earn some money. And she's a tailoress, and so she brings sewing work into her home, and she's able to make enough money to feed them. And so there's even the chance that they might be able to sell some of the cakes that they've learnt to make in my kitchen to earn some money too, for such a time as this. When I arrived in Lamjung, I decided to visit all of the 7 churches in the town. But on my first Saturday, I went to a small church of around 15 to 20, much smaller than in the picture you can see there. I think I told you about the Nepali church the last time I came to visit. But this was the one that I went to on my first Saturday, and I felt so welcome that I stayed. The church had a new pastor. You can see him there. He's the one in the bright yellow t-shirt. He's not a shy person, isn't our pastor? But he has a real understanding of how to disciple new believers, how to explain the gospel to people from a Hindu background. And he also has a vision for a church of over 200 believers. That's a great step up from 15 to 20 when I first went there. But we're now seeing the first steps of this happening, as there were 12 new believers baptized recently in our church. And we have one of our young people who's just completed Bible training to become our second pastor. Such a vision has practical implications. The building was too small and it was prone to flooding. And so part of the reason I felt I was there was that I was able to channel some money from BMS and from individual supporters to help the church to build a wall and to build this outdoor kitchen. When I say build it, they actually built it themselves in their own hands. The pastor was up to his waist. I don't know what David's building skills are. Maybe he'll be a building pastor too. But Isaac was building the wall with the young people himself in the river. Food plays a large part in any celebration, and so the outdoor kitchen is a real asset to the church. This was my farewell when we met together and shared fellowship together. But it's been a privilege to have been there at this time to support the pastor and his family, to pray with them, to reflect with them, and to discuss and to listen to his plans for the future. And to be part of that vibrant, believing church has been such a privilege. While I've been in Nepal, they've been like my family and made living in Basi Sahar so much easier for such a time as this. My work is with EQUIP, KISK-EQUIP, which stands for Education Quality Improvement Programme, and it involves providing training and support to teachers in 15 schools in Lamjung, and we have other projects around the country. Most of my colleagues live in Kathmandu and they travel out to give training, but I live there all the time. So I gave training in different things. Phonics is my favorite, but also grade teaching, problem solving, like we tried this morning, and nursery teachers training. But I think that the most important thing that I could contribute to our work was just being there, to be able to visit the schools and hear of their problems. You might remember the time in the first picture you can see when the students in one of our school hostels were cold at night and they couldn't study the next day. They couldn't sleep because they were so cold. And I realized that I had some blankets at home that I could give to them. And then I asked friends in Kathmandu and they sent blankets too. And we managed to get 52 blankets for the students. So they all got 2 blankets each and they were very cozy so they could sleep well and then they could study well the next day. And we've been able to set up some computer labs in some of our schools with BMS donations, which is amazing. It's a great asset to providing good education. But as I visited schools and talked to teachers, I realized that most of our teachers don't know how to use the computer well, and they're not confident to teach their students. So they were not being used. So when I heard of that, I spoke to my colleagues in Kathmandu, and they found a computer school in Kathmandu with students who were willing to go and live for a month in our villages. And so they lived among the students, and they taught every day in the school. And so the teachers became much more confident, and so did the students. So hearing of that need, we were able to do something about it. And you've heard about the school feeding program, which wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been there to hear a teacher say that that was the biggest difficulty for her students, that they were so tired and hungry in the afternoon, they couldn't concentrate. And so there's some of our students enjoying their lunch. And the next picture is going to come. Yeah, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. This is one of my favorite pictures. Oh, disappeared. Tell me what you can see in this picture. Shout out, what do you see? No shoes, thanks. Happy children, brilliant. Anything else? Backpacks, yeah, great. Yep, alone, little children alone on the path. Might not happen here in Redditch, would it? Kind of, yeah, although that is what children would wear in Nepal. That's what they would wear. Okay, if you'd been there, you would have also smelt the smell. They were not the tidiest and cleanest of children, so there was a little bit of a pong as I met them on the path. Let me tell you the story behind this picture. I was walking home from school where I'd been working with the teachers, and I met these two students leaving the nursery class on their way home. So they'd finished a little bit earlier than the rest of the children. And they told me where they lived, and I knew that the village was about 40 minutes away and they were walking home. But they told me, yes, they loved school because the teachers were kind. They got to play with some toys, which we had given them through Equip in the nursery class. But the best thing was that they got food. They got a lunch. And they also told me that they'd got a new backpack from the bank. The bank had given backpacks to all of the nursery children, and they were so excited to have a backpack. And I said, show me what's in your backpack. And they opened it, and there was nothing in either of them. So as they had no uniform, which you would expect, and no resources and no shoes, I spoke to one of the teachers in the school the next time I visited. And he told me that these are children from a Chepang village. Chepangs are low-caste people who traditionally would not send their children to school. But because they realized that they can get food at the school, there are now 18 Chepang children enrolled in this school. So whatever the reason, we are glad that they're going to school now and getting an education. But, said the teacher, it's so difficult to teach them because they have no pencils, no notebooks, no textbooks, and no uniform. Maybe not so important for nursery children, but for the older children, that was a real problem. So hearing of that situation, I was able to share with my colleagues, and we have been able to give a scholarship to 3 of the Chepang students. Only 3, but that means 3 families can send their children to school and feed their children well. And the next time I went to the school, I took some pencils and notebooks to give to the teacher to hand out to those who didn't have. But if I hadn't met those children on the path, I wouldn't have realized of that particular problem, but I was there in the right place at the right time. Equip has been going through a time of reflection and evaluation after 15, 16 years working in schools. We want to make sure that our program is as effective as possible. And it's been good, I feel, for me to have been there at that time as we've discussed the future. And one of the things that we've realized is the importance of having trainers living in the project. I was living in Basie Sahar, and so I could be among our teachers and hear what their problems were. So we would have a training, for example, I would do a phonics training with my teachers from all of the schools, and they would come together, we'd spend a day or 2 days together, and at the end of that they would get very excited about phonics. I saw Sophie doing phonics in her book this morning, but phonics has taken off here, and we're trying to introduce it in Nepal. And so they would get really excited. Oh yes, I can do this. I want to teach phonics to my students. And then I would go and visit them a couple of weeks later, and they would say, it's difficult, Joy ma'am, it's difficult. It's not on the timetable, so we don't know when to teach phonics. We need the other teachers to understand about phonics too, because if I teach phonics and then they go to another teacher, they don't understand. And we need the parents to understand about phonics too, because their children are coming home saying, apple, and their parents think they're crazy, and we're crazy too. So we need the parents to understand about it, and we need some more resources. So hearing of that, I was able to suggest that we did parents' seminars to show the parents what a difference it would make. And we do whole school training for teachers, so that even if they're not teaching phonics, at least they understand it. And we provide more resources. The right place at the right time. Let me tell you about two of my colleagues in Equip that I've worked with very closely, Krishna and Santona. Krishna is the director of the teacher training in Equip, so he organizes all our teacher training programs around the country. And he's also, along with Dil, who's the head of Equip, he's supported by BMS. He's a supported partner worker in Equip. So his salary is paid at the moment through BMS. And as BMS is now having fewer missionaries from the UK going overseas, it's possible as a church that you could support Krishna or Dil instead of me in the future. And if you'd like more information about that, I can tell you. Santona is an English teacher trainer, and she has a real passion for girls in school and wants to encourage girls to attend school and to read. And she's written books that challenge the gender stereotypes, proving that girls can be whatever they want to be. But although she'd worked as an English teacher, she had never heard of phonics. And neither had I until I came back from Nepal in 1996 and started work again in Primary 1 in Scotland. And there was a new program, Jolly Phonics, that had just come in that I quickly had to learn how to use in my class in Scotland. But I soon realized that it was a good program and that it helped all of my students to read. And I also realized it would be great for Nepal if somebody had the time to rewrite it so that it wasn't so Western and it was more suitable for Nepal. And during COVID, when I couldn't visit schools, that's what I was able to do. And so we now have a full program of phonics that is good for Nepal. And Santona was great to help me to realize if the stories that were in the books were suitable for Nepal. And she became interested in phonics too, and we worked on trainings together and follow-ups together. And she is very committed, very able, and very competent to teach phonics to our teachers in the future. And she's also very strong. You can see her carrying a box of resources to a school in one of our school visits. But isn't it amazing that God brought the two of us together at the right time to work on that phonics program? And that leads me to my last point. As I leave Nepal, what of the future? Can I say that this is right for me for such a time as this? How do you know when it's time to move on? There's always more work that could be done. There's always more that I could do in Nepal. And it was difficult to leave in Nepal. Perhaps it would have been better to have stayed another year until that project was finished in March next year. And I don't know what the future holds. I'm supposed to retire, but I'm sure that there will be something that I will do, but I don't know what it is that God has for me to do in the future. Perhaps I'll be able to continue to support the work of Equip from the UK, or maybe go and visit. I'm still writing resources that can be used for Equip in future trainings. And I hope when we have our celebration of the end of the project in Lamjung in February next year, that I'll be able to be there and to celebrate with our teachers in Lamjung. But I've handed over what I've been doing to the teacher trainers who are there, and they will be very able to continue the phonics training. The nursery teachers training has been taken over by Narajan. He is a science secondary teacher, so it's not really his gifting or his skill or his passion, but he's the best we've got at the minute. Perhaps you could pray that we would find a teacher with experience of early years who could train our nursery school teachers. But I know that the work of Equip will continue and flourish even when I'm not there, or perhaps especially when I'm not there, because the Equip team are committed and the work is in good hands. But it's more satisfying to know that it's in God's hands and He will make it happen, because God's timing is perfect. He prepares us and then He places us at a specific time, in a certain place, for his purposes. And sometimes he moves us on, because his timing is perfect. We may not know what the future holds, but God does, for such a time as this. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. We were due to have another song, but I'm looking at such a time as this. So Becca, could you pop out and ask the youngsters to come in? And just a couple of reminders, there's all the resources here to come and have a look at, and plenty of copies for you to take away. There are even some left over from when Liz and Sergio had